I finally explained to my husband why I never wanted children. The next morning, I overheard him telling his mom that he wouldn't have married me if he'd known. Later, I discovered that all of our protection had been tampered with. I met Mark 3 years ago at a small bar in the city. I was there with friends, celebrating a coworker's promotion, and Mark was with a group of his own. We locked eyes across the room, and soon enough, he made his way over. He was charming, confident without being arrogant. We clicked immediately, and as the night went on, I found myself opening up more than I usually did with strangers. After that, things moved quickly between us. By our 4th date, I knew it was time for the talk. We were having dinner at a cozy Italian place when I decided to lay it out clearly. "Just so you know," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm not interested in having kids. Ever." I told him it wasn't up for debate, that it wasn't some temporary thing. It was a choice rooted deep within me, tied to painful memories I rarely shared. Mark looked me straight in the eyes and said, "I get it." I respect that. His response felt sincere, and I believed him. It was a relief to find someone who seemed to understand. As the months went by, Mark and I grew closer. He was patient, funny, and seemed genuinely content with our lifestyle: weekend getaways, quiet nights watching movies, and spontaneous road trips. He never once hinted at wanting children, and I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I'd found someone who could truly accept me as I was. A year ago, Mark proposed during a trip to a cabin we rented near a serene lake. It was simple, without grand gestures, but it felt right. Before I said yes, I brought up the child-free issue again. "Are you sure you're okay with this?" I asked, searching his eyes for any sign of hesitation. Mark took my hands in his and reassured me, "I am absolutely sure. You're enough for me." I felt tears welling up, but they were the happy kind. We got married a few months later, and for the first 6 months, it truly was bliss. We fell into a rhythm that felt natural, like we were two halves of a whole. I thought I had finally found my safe haven, someone I could trust entirely. Then, 2 weeks ago, everything began to unravel. It all started with a message from my estranged sister, Rachel. I hadn't spoken to her in over a decade, and just seeing her name on my phone made my stomach twist into knots. It took me a while to even open the message. When I finally did, it was a single line: "I need to talk to you." My hands shook as I read it, and suddenly, the past I had tried so hard to escape came rushing back. Growing up, our mother was mostly absent, lost in her addictions and bad decisions. My siblings and I often went without food, clean clothes, or even basic supervision. I was the oldest, so I became their caretaker. By the time I was 16, I was burned out. I swore to myself that I'd never bring a child into this world if I couldn't guarantee them the stability I never had. I carried this decision into every relationship, but Mark was the first partner who seemed to truly understand why I felt the way I did. The message from Rachel sent me spiraling. I hadn't realized how much unresolved pain I was still carrying. I broke down in tears during my next therapy session, finally confronting the weight of my childhood. My therapist suggested that I talk to Mark about it, to be honest about the roots of my decision to remain child-free. It felt terrifying, but I knew I needed to open up to him. When Mark returned from a work trip later that week, I sat him down in the living room. My voice was shaky as I began to speak. "There's something I need to tell you," I said. "I don't think I've ever explained why I feel so strongly about not having kids." He nodded, looking genuinely concerned. I told him everything: the long nights I spent comforting crying siblings, the times I went hungry so they could eat, and the unbearable sense of responsibility that crushed me before I even reached adulthood. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I recounted memories I had tried to bury, and Mark listened quietly. When I was finished, he wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I'm here for you." For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe I could truly be seen and accepted. But that feeling was short-lived. The very next morning, I was walking down the stairs when I heard Mark's voice coming from the kitchen. He was on the phone with his mom, and I couldn't help but pause when I heard my name. "I don't know if I would have married her if I'd known the full story," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "It's just selfish not to want kids at all." I felt like the ground had vanished beneath my feet. I gripped the banister, my breath catching in my throat. How could he say that? I thought we were on the same page, that he understood me. But now, it seemed like everything was built on a lie. I backed away slowly, trying not to make a sound, my heart pounding. I felt betrayed in a way I hadn't anticipated. As I sat alone in our bedroom later that morning, I realized that Mark had never truly accepted my stance on children. He had only pretended to. And I had fallen for it. The rest of that morning felt surreal. I walked back to the bedroom on unsteady legs, my heart heavy with confusion and anger. I shut the door softly behind me, then slumped onto the edge of the bed, trying to process what I'd just heard. Mark's words replayed in my head, each one a dagger. I wouldn't have married her if I knew all this. It felt like the floor had been pulled out from under me. The man I thought I knew had just unraveled everything we'd built. I stayed in the bedroom for hours, numb and uncertain. My phone buzzed a few times, but I ignored it, too dazed to even glance at the screen. I kept replaying the last 3 years in my mind, wondering if I had missed something, some sign that Mark was never truly on board with the child-free life we had supposedly agreed on. Every time I tried to dismiss the thought, his voice from the kitchen would echo back, sharper and colder. It's just selfish not to want kids. Eventually, I forced myself to get up and face the rest of the day. I couldn't let Mark see how shattered I was not yet. I needed time to gather my thoughts, to decide how to confront him without falling apart. I made my way downstairs, plastering a neutral expression on my face, and found Mark in the living room, scrolling through his phone as if nothing was wrong. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. "Hey, babe," he said casually, "want to grab lunch in a bit?" It took everything in me to return that smile, even though I could feel tears threatening to break through. "Sure," I said, keeping my voice steady. I needed more time before I could confront him, and I didn't want to reveal what I'd overheard. Not yet. I felt a strange sense of detachment as I watched Mark go about his day, making small talk about work and weekend plans as if everything was normal. It was like he was playing a role, and I suddenly felt like a spectator in my own life. That night, I lay awake in bed, unable to sleep with Mark beside me. The sound of his even breathing felt almost mocking. I stared at the ceiling, replaying his conversation with his mom over and over. I knew I had to confront him, but the thought filled me with dread. What if he denied it? What if he doubled down, revealing even more of the disappointment and resentment I'd overheard? The next morning, I tried to act normal, making coffee and forcing small talk, but I was barely holding it together. Mark was cheerful, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "You okay?" he asked at one point, noticing my distant gaze. "Just tired," I lied. It wasn't the right time, not with so much anger and hurt swirling in me. I needed a clear head, so I decided to wait a bit longer. A few days later, I got my chance. It was a Friday evening, and Mark had just gotten home from work. We were in the kitchen, and I had opened a bottle of wine, trying to calm my nerves. I could feel the tension bubbling up inside me as I poured 2 glasses, my hands shaking slightly. I took a deep breath and said, "Mark, there's something I need to talk to you about." He looked up from his phone, his expression shifting to mild concern. "What's going on?" he asked. I took a sip of wine, steeling myself. "The other day, I overheard you talking to your mom," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "You said you wouldn't have married me if you'd known the full story. You called me selfish." I watched his face closely, trying to gauge his reaction. Mark blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "You heard that?" he asked, his voice softening. For a moment, I thought I saw guilt flash in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. "Look, I was just venting. It was a private conversation." "That's not the point," I shot back, my voice finally breaking. "I was honest with you from the start about everything. You said you were okay with it. Was that all a lie?" He sighed, rubbing his forehead as if trying to ward off a headache. "I wasn't lying, but I guess I thought things might change. People change their minds all the time." "You knew how deeply this goes for me," I said, tears welling up despite my efforts to stay composed. "This isn't about changing my mind. It's who I am." Mark looked down at the table, his jaw clenched. "I just thought you might feel differently once you were in a stable relationship," he muttered, as if it were the most logical assumption in the world. His words were a slap in the face, a confirmation of what I'd feared since overhearing him. "And if I never change?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What then?" He hesitated, then looked at me with a mixture of frustration and defeat. "I don't know," he admitted. I hoped. I felt like I couldn't breathe. He hadn't been waiting for me to change, he'd been banking on it. All the reassurances, the "you're enough for me" promises, had been part of a bigger, silent gamble. "I can't believe you were willing to gamble with my life like that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's face crumpled, but he didn't respond. We sat there in painful silence, the reality of our situation settling in. That night, I slept in the guest room, my thoughts a mess of anger and betrayal. It was clear that Mark hadn't just lied. He had bet everything on a version of me that didn't exist, and I wasn't sure I could forgive him for that. But there was still more to uncover, more that I wasn't ready to confront just yet. It had been a tense few days since I confronted Mark about what I overheard. We'd barely spoken, each of us navigating around the other like strangers in our own home. I was exhausted, emotionally drained by the confrontation and the uncomfortable silence that followed. I spent most of my time lost in thought, trying to figure out if this marriage was salvageable or even real to begin with. One morning, I decided to focus on something mundane to clear my head. I started tidying up the bedroom, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. As I moved to the drawer where we kept our box of condoms, something caught my eye. I picked up the box, feeling a strange sense of unease. I took one out, examining it closely. That's when I noticed it, a tiny puncture mark, almost unnoticeable if you weren't looking for it. My heart started pounding as I grabbed another condom. Same mark. I began tearing through the entire box, and every single one had the same small, deliberate puncture. I felt a wave of nausea hit me, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't something that could just happen. Panic quickly set in. Was this a deliberate act? Had Mark really tampered with our protection? My mind raced, unable to accept the horrifying implications. Trying to steady myself, I decided to check my birth control pills next. I counted them carefully. There were several missing. My hands started shaking uncontrollably. I could barely breathe as the reality of the situation settled in. Mark hadn't just been hoping for me to change my mind. He'd actively tried to trap me into a pregnancy. That night, I was waiting when Mark came home from work. He walked into the living room and paused, sensing the heavy atmosphere. "Hey, what's going on?" he asked, his tone cautious. I couldn't hold back anymore. I held up the tampered box of condoms, my voice shaking with both anger and disbelief. "What is this, Mark? Did you do this?" His face paled, but then, shockingly, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he shifted into a calm, almost condescending tone. "Look, I know this seems bad," he started, taking a step toward me. "But you don't understand. I did it because I love you. I know how much your past affects you, and I really believed that if you became a mom, you'd heal. You'd see that you were meant for it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You tampered with our contraception because you thought it was for my own good?" I shouted, feeling a hot wave of rage rise up. "You tried to take away my choice, Mark. How could you possibly think this was okay?" He seemed taken aback by my anger, as if he genuinely hadn't expected this reaction. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he insisted, his voice more defensive now. "I was trying to help you see what you really want deep down. I thought you'd be grateful." "Gratefuls?" I repeated, my voice cracking with disbelief. "You're trying to justify this by pretending it's for my benefit?" This wasn't love, Mark. This was manipulation. Tears were streaming down my face now, but they were angry tears. I felt violated, not just physically but emotionally. He had taken my trust and used it against me in the most personal way possible. Mark seemed to realize he had crossed an unforgivable line, but he still tried to salvage the situation. "You have to understand," he pleaded. "I just want a family. I thought if you could experience it, you'd change your mind. You'd love it." "You don't get it," I interrupted, my voice dangerously low. "I never hid who I was. I never pretended I wanted kids. I never lied to you. But you lied to me." I felt a surge of anger so intense I could barely stand still. "You didn't want me, Mark. You wanted the idea of me, the potential of someone who might someday fit your plans." He stood there, looking helpless, but still stubborn. "I know it was wrong, but I believed you'd thank me eventually," he said quietly, almost desperately. "I thought I was saving you from a life of regret. I couldn't take it anymore." I turned away, feeling sick to my stomach. I had never felt so betrayed, so deeply violated. I knew in that moment that this was beyond repair. I couldn't forgive someone who had so thoroughly disregarded my autonomy. "You didn't save me from anything," I said, my back still turned. "You only proved that I can't trust you, ever again." The following hours were a blur. I packed a bag with shaking hands, grabbing essentials while Mark hovered nearby, trying to get me to stay, to talk it out. But I was done talking. "You need to leave," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. "I can't be near you right now." "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice small and panicked. "I don't know," I replied, honestly. "But I can't be here." I walked out of the house, my heart shattered, but my resolve unbroken. I knew this wasn't over, but I couldn't spend another minute in a place that felt like a prison of broken promises and twisted love. I was determined to reclaim my life, even if it meant starting over from scratch. As I drove away, the reality of what Mark had done settled heavily over me. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a complete violation of everything I stood for. He hadn't just lied, he'd tried to rob me of my choice, my body, and my future. And now, as I headed toward the unknown, I was determined to rebuild what he'd tried to destroy: my autonomy, my sense of self, and my right to choose my own path. I drove aimlessly through the city that night, unsure of where to go but certain I couldn't stay in that house a second longer. My mind was reeling, but I felt a sense of urgency pushing me forward. I eventually found a small, nondescript hotel and checked in. The clerk gave me a sympathetic look, probably noticing my puffy eyes and disheveled appearance, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere, anywhere, where Mark couldn't reach me. As soon as I got into the room, I collapsed on the bed, overwhelmed by a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. It felt like I was watching my life crumble in real time, like I was an outsider in my own story. I wanted to scream, cry, and throw things, but all I could do was stare blankly at the ceiling. I stayed like that for hours, replaying everything in my mind: Mark's reassurances, his promises, and now, his calculated betrayal. The weight of it all pressed down on me until I finally broke. I curled up on the bed and cried until I couldn't cry anymore. By the next morning, I knew what I had to do. I called a lawyer I'd found through a quick search on my phone, barely able to steady my voice enough to explain my situation. "I want to file for divorce," I said, the words tasting both bitter and strangely liberating. The lawyer was kind, professional, and efficient. We arranged a consultation for later that day, and I left the hotel with a newfound sense of determination, albeit shaky. At the lawyer's office, I signed the initial paperwork. My hand trembled as I put pen to paper, officially starting the process of ending my marriage. It felt surreal, like I was crossing a bridge I never thought I'd need to approach, let alone burn. The numbness lingered as I left the office and headed back to the hotel. I had no plan beyond taking things one day at a time. I blocked Mark's number, as well as his mother's, but it didn't take long for messages from his family to start pouring in from unknown numbers. Some were accusatory, labeling me as a quitter and blaming me for ruining Mark's life. Others were more insidious, trying to guilt-trip me by saying things like, "Don't you see how much he loves you? He did this because he believes in you." I couldn't believe the nerve of these people. Did they think they could pressure me into going back, as if I'd just had a petty argument? As if tampering with contraception wasn't a gross violation of trust? It was infuriating, but I didn't respond to any of them. I refused to engage. Mark's own messages were a mix of pleading and manipulation. He alternated between apologizing profusely and trying to explain away his actions. "I was just desperate to show you a different side of life. I swear, I only did it out of love." He even tried to appeal to my emotions. "I know I messed up, but can we at least talk? We're supposed to be a team." The irony wasn't lost on me. He was trying to appeal to the same sense of loyalty he had shattered. I stayed strong, but the isolation was suffocating. I hadn't reached out to anyone yet, partly because I was too ashamed to admit what had happened and partly because I didn't want to burden anyone with my mess. It felt like the people closest to me would judge me for not seeing the signs sooner, for believing in a man who had deceived me so thoroughly. The loneliness was a new kind of pain, but I kept reminding myself that I would rather be alone than trapped in a relationship that had become toxic and deceitful. I knew that going back would mean losing myself entirely, and that was a price I wasn't willing to pay. I started looking for a new apartment, hoping that having a space of my own would help me rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. Every day was a new struggle, adjusting to the reality of being alone, navigating the legal proceedings, and trying to find a new normal. I started therapy again, this time focusing on processing not just the betrayal, but also the deeper wounds that had resurfaced. I told my therapist about the overwhelming sense of guilt I felt, not just for falling for Mark's deception, but for staying as long as I did. She reassured me that leaving was the bravest thing I could have done and that I wasn't to blame for someone else's manipulative behavior. As I started to find my footing, Mark's desperation grew more intense. He even showed up at my workplace one afternoon, looking haggard and desperate. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but I love you. I can't lose you." I stepped back, keeping my voice calm but firm.
You already lost me, Mark.
You lost me when you chose to manipulate me instead of respecting me. His face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something, maybe sadness, maybe pity. But it wasn't enough to make me reconsider. I walked away, knowing that my decision was the right one. Despite everything, the messages from his family continued, becoming nastier and more personal as time went on. You never deserved him, one read. Another accused me of abandoning Mark when he needed me the most. I realized then how deep his family's enabling behavior ran. They were more concerned with keeping up appearances than acknowledging the seriousness of what Mark had done. But their words couldn't reach me anymore. I was focused on rebuilding my life, one small step at a time. I signed a lease for a small apartment on the other side of town, and as I unpacked boxes, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of control over my own life. It was messy, uncertain, and sometimes painfully lonely, but it was mine. And that was enough for now. For a brief moment, I started to feel a small sense of hope. My new apartment wasn't much. It was tiny. The walls were a bland shade of beige, and the furniture was minimal, but it was mine. I had slowly started to piece together a new routine. Therapy sessions twice a week, long walks to clear my head, and cooking simple meals for myself. It felt like I was finally moving forward. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You can't run from this forever. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I read it, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the tone, the implied threat behind them. I reread the message, hoping it was some kind of mistake, maybe spam. But deep down, I knew it wasn't random. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a longer message. It was from Rachel, my estranged sister. I know this is hard for you, she wrote, but Mark reached out to me. He told me everything, and he wants to help you get better. You're going to regret this decision if you don't listen to him. My hands shook as I read her words. Rachel was the one person who knew just how deep my childhood trauma ran. She was there when I was forced to act as a mother to our siblings. She was there when our own mother chose addiction over her children. Rachel knew my pain better than anyone, and now she was siding with Mark, the man who had tried to take away my choice. It was like a knife twisting in an already open wound. I felt a mix of rage and despair. How could she betray me like this? I dialed her number, not caring that it was late. She answered after a few rings, her voice calm. "Hey," she said, almost casually, as if we hadn't been estranged for years. "What the hell, Rachel?" I snapped, unable to hold back. "Why are you talking to Mark? Do you have any idea what he's done?" Rachel sighed, as if she were the one who was exhausted. "I know you think you're doing what's best, but I've been talking to him, and he's not a bad guy. He really believes that you're just scared, and that you'll regret not having a family." I felt a surge of anger, my voice rising. "You don't get it, do you? He tampered with our contraception, Rachel. He tried to trap me into a pregnancy I never wanted. And you're helping him." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm just trying to make you see that maybe you've closed yourself off too much. I know what we went through, but that doesn't mean you can't ever change." Her words cut deep. It wasn't just that she was siding with Mark, it was that she genuinely believed I was broken, and that forcing me into motherhood was some twisted way to fix me. I hung up without another word, unable to stomach the conversation any longer. I felt like the world was caving in, as if the one person who should have understood me had aligned herself with my worst nightmare. I was alone again, in a way that felt even more isolating than before. Mark's betrayal was one thing, but my own sister's involvement was an entirely different kind of pain. It was as if I had been fighting not just Mark's manipulations, but also my own family's deep-seated belief that I was somehow damaged. For a while, I shut down. I stopped responding to texts, avoided calls, and kept to myself. I knew I was slipping into a dark place, but I couldn't bring myself to do anything about it. The weight of betrayal, layered with years of unresolved trauma, felt too heavy to carry. But then, one morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. I realized that my entire life had been shaped by people trying to control me. My mother's neglect, my siblings' dependence, and now Mark and Rachel's attempts to redefine what was best for me. I knew I couldn't keep living in the shadow of other people's expectations. I couldn't let their twisted versions of love dictate my choices. That day, I made an appointment with my therapist, determined to shift the focus of my sessions. I wasn't just going to talk about Mark or Rachel. I needed to rebuild my sense of self from the ground up. We started working on boundary setting, on reclaiming the parts of me that had been lost in other people's narratives. I had always been a survivor, but now I wanted to be more than that. I wanted to thrive. The messages from Rachel continued, but I didn't respond. Her pleas became more desperate, and at one point, she even tried to show up at my apartment unannounced. I didn't let her in. I knew I had to protect myself, even if it meant cutting ties with the last piece of my family. Mark's attempts to contact me became less frequent, but he still found ways to remind me of his presence, a voicemail here, a letter there. They were always filled with promises of change, with declarations of love that felt hollow after everything he had done. I knew better than to believe him, but each message still stirred up a mix of anger and sadness. It was hard to let go of the idea of who I thought he was, but I reminded myself that he had never been that person to begin with. As I continued therapy, I felt a shift. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was there, a slow, gradual reclaiming of my own life. I began making small plans for the future, like enrolling in an art class I had always wanted to take. I reconnected with a few friends I had pushed away during my marriage, explaining my situation as honestly as I could. Some were shocked, others were supportive, but all of them were glad to have me back. I knew I still had a long road ahead. Healing wasn't linear, and there were days when the weight of the past felt overwhelming. But for the first time, I felt like I had the tools to navigate it. I was no longer trying to survive in spite of other people's intentions. I was building a life that was fully my own, one decision at a time. And while the scars of betrayal remained, I wore them as reminders of my resilience, not my weakness. I had been pushed, manipulated, and deceived, but I hadn't broken. I was still standing, and that in itself was a victory. It's been a few months since I filed for divorce, and I'm settling into my new apartment, this modest one-bedroom that feels both foreign and freeing. The walls are still bare, but I've started decorating slowly, choosing things that represent me, not some version of us that I once tried to maintain. I bought a few plants, hung some cheap string lights, and I painted the kitchen a bright yellow. It's not much, but it's mine. It's a space that I've filled with my choices, my decisions, no compromises, no manipulations. The first few weeks were filled with a mix of relief and sadness. I couldn't shake the feeling of failure that came with ending a marriage, even one built on deceit. Every time I unpacked a box, I stumbled across memories that felt bittersweet, souvenirs from trips we took, photos from happy moments that now felt like someone else's life. I put most of them in a storage bin, unable to throw them away just yet, but not ready to keep them out either. Mark's family didn't make things easy. Even though I had blocked most of their numbers, they found other ways to reach out, emails, social media messages, even letters sent to my new address. They insisted that I was giving up on Mark, that I was heartless for leaving him when he was just trying to build a family. But I knew better now. This wasn't about love or family, it was about control. One evening, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox. It was from Mark. I debated whether to open it, my stomach twisting with a mix of curiosity and dread. Against my better judgment, I tore it open. It was filled with pages of apologies, explanations, and declarations of love. The opening line read, "I know I messed up, but everything I did was for us." I couldn't read any further. There was no us anymore, and there hadn't been for a while. I folded the letter and threw it in the trash, feeling a strange mix of anger and closure. I realized then that Mark's words, whether sincere or manipulative, no longer had the power to sway me. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. But even with this newfound sense of clarity, some days are harder than others. I have moments where I find myself questioning everything that happened. Was I too harsh? Did I really give my all? Or did I run away at the first sign of trouble? Those thoughts sneak up on me during the quiet moments, while I'm brushing my teeth, making coffee, or lying in bed at night. They're uncomfortable, but I let them pass without dwelling on them too long. I've learned to trust my decision, even if it sometimes feels messy. Therapy continues to be my anchor. My therapist has helped me recognize patterns I wasn't aware of before, ways I'd conditioned myself to accept less than I deserved, how I had internalized the idea that love meant enduring someone else's idea of what's best for me. We talk about boundaries a lot now. It's an ongoing process, learning to protect my space and my peace. I've had to relearn how to say no and mean it, how to stand firm without feeling guilty. Recently, I went out for drinks with a few friends. It was the first time in a long while that I felt comfortable being around others. We laughed, shared stories, and for a few hours, I felt like a normal person again. One of my friends asked me about dating if I'd thought about getting back out there. I was honest, I hadn't. The thought of opening myself up to someone else's intentions still felt too raw. But I also knew that I wasn't closed off to the idea forever.
Just not now.
For the first time in years, I've started focusing on myself in ways I never have before. I picked up a paintbrush for the first time since high school and spent an entire weekend losing myself in colors and canvases. I've even joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do, but never made time for. These small steps forward feel monumental, like each one is a piece of me being reclaimed. I'm learning to enjoy my own company, to be okay with the silence rather than fear it. I still get the occasional call from Rachel, though I haven't answered any of them. Her voicemails are a mix of apologies and excuses, but I'm not ready to deal with that yet. Maybe one day I'll have the energy to confront her betrayal, to untangle whatever twisted logic led her to side with Mark. But for now, I need the space to heal without reopening old wounds. The other day, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, really looking at my reflection. I expected to see the same weary, tired version of myself that I'd been seeing for months. But there was something different in my eyes, a sense of strength that had been buried beneath layers of compromise and pain. I felt proud of that, of how far I'd come. I'd been stripped down to nothing, but I was rebuilding, piece by piece. I don't know what the future holds, and that's okay. I know that I won't settle for someone who thinks they can fix me or mold me into what they want. I won't let anyone undermine my choices or use love as a weapon. I've come too far to let that happen again. I'm still scared at times, still haunted by what could have been, but I'm more determined than ever to build a life that is entirely mine, free from manipulation, from compromise that costs too much, and from anyone who tries to take away my autonomy. It's a slow, ongoing journey, but it's one I'm finally ready to embrace.